Hello everybody and welcome to the Happy Dystopian. Today I want to talk to you about how the internet, which used to be seen as a worldwide phenomenon, is slowly splitting up into different parts. And to explain what I mean by that, we have to go a bit back into history. So the decade in which the internet became widely known and widely used for the first time was in the 1990s. And during this period, the internet was seen as part of a wider movement towards globalization, towards one world, towards a global village. And therefore, when the internet was used for the first time as a browser, it came to be known as the World Wide Web. And this idea really fits into the time period of the 1990s. So keep in mind, first of all, that the 1990s saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. So before that, from the 40s up until the late 80s, the world was split into multiple parts. One of them known as the Free West, which was mostly led by the United States. And on the other hand, there was the Communist East, which was led by the Soviet Union. Soviet Union being a country which later on split into multiple parts. The largest of which was Russia. So before the 90s, there was a big ideological struggle going on in the world. And in the 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, everyone agrees that the Western way of living with a free market was the best way, and that even famously led political scientist Francis Fukuyama to declare the end of history. So we have had a long history with a lot of conflicts between different cultures, between different ideas, between different ideologies, and from the 90s onward, history would be ending. And there would just be the same story for the whole world. Well, as we now know, of course, that did not happen. We are still very much within the realm of history with a lot of different ideas, different countries also struggling to see who has the right answer to the problems of today. But in that time, we believed in the end of history. And also the internet was seen as part of this movement. The internet was a Western concept by origin, and the internet was also spreading Western ideas of freedom and democracy all around the world. Keep in mind that the internet became much more useful also in this time period. Email was invented after in the late 90s and early 2000s. We saw the start of Google, the search engine, Amazon, which was one of the first online stores, as well as Facebook, which became really famous for their introduction of so-called social media. And all of these companies were American. So that was the way in which the internet was at first perceived. However, very soon there came a response. And there were also other countries which were not happy with the increased influence of the US. So they started a reaction to insulate themselves from this influence. And the most prolific country in this regard was China. Already in the late 90s, the Chinese started to experiment with ways in which they could control the flow of information from outside of China into China. And they already drew up their defenses in an operation which came to be known as the Great Firewall of China. The government would control what information would be allowed to spread. Well, after time, other countries as well embraced the Chinese model. So a very well-known example is Iran, a country which is also ruled by an authoritarian regime, where the government also controls what its citizens are watching online. But also in countries even far further away, such as Venezuela, where the government is able to switch off the internet to prevent unrest. For example, when people try to coordinate protests. So the World Wide Web has never been unchallenged. There have always been reactions to it as well. And then the United States themselves, they also did something to reduce the worldwide image of the internet. And that came about after the terrible attacks of 9/11, where the Americans started their war on terror, and the internet became an important tool in that war as well. So as we later learned from Edward Snowden, the United States started a project in 2007, which was known as Prism. It was run by the NSA, the National Security Agency. Very secretive agency. The joke was often made that NSA stood for no such agency, so it was very secretive. However, after the revelations of Edward Snowden, it became clear that because the United States is a hub for a lot of the internet traffic across the world, they're also able to take the information which is passing through their country and to look at it to see what is being communicated around the world. So what happened was that they would look at all of the emails and other communications which were being done in the Middle East, in Europe, and in Asia, and in all countries outside of the US, basically. And they would scan that information to see if there was anything of interest to the security forces. So, for example, if people were communicating online to try and coordinate a terror attack, the NSA would try to find those messages and to use that intelligence to combat the terrorists. One company which was very important in that regard was Palantir. So this is a company which is set up shortly after 9/11. And this company uses artificial intelligence to sift through this enormous volume of data to find the data which is needed to enhance security. The company only works for Western governments. So the CEO has said basically that he is a patriot who wants to defend the West from harm. So Palantir is only working for Western countries, Western law enforcement, Western intelligence agencies, and they are clearly not working for countries outside of the West, such as China. So to summarize, internet, first of all, known as very open, worldwide phenomenon, used to spread ideas of democracy and freedom, immediately ran into reactionary forces. And also, the United States themselves started to use the internet not just as a free space for the exchange of ideas, but also to gather more intelligence for their own foreign security ends. So those two phenomenon work together to make the internet less of a free space and more of a space in which foreign relations and intelligence actions took place. And then next, of course, currently the tables have turned. So as I talked about in my latest videos, many countries outside of the West have started the so-called troll factories to influence Western public opinion. So this is a case in which the internet is actually used against the Western powers to destabilize them. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, in the 90s and 2000, there were all these American companies which were important in granting more useful capabilities to the internet. And right now, China is also coming up in the internet industry, and they have actually created a lot of alternatives. So there is WeChat, there is Alibaba, which is also a huge online marketplace. So basically the Americans are no longer the only game in town. And an example which is even more successful is TikTok. So TikTok is also social media in which you make short videos. It's very popular among those people who are born in the current century. So for young people, TikTok is extremely popular, also in Western countries. However, it is a Chinese company, so that's sort of like a switch. So the tables have turned. So what does all of this mean? Well, the conclusion is that the internet is going to be split into at least two parts, one led by the US and one led by China, in which the US-led internet is also going to be used in other free countries, such as in Europe, Latin America, and in Japan and India probably as well, where the Chinese will export their own internet infrastructure and companies also to other authoritarian regimes. And in that sense, the internet will no longer be global, but will be more regionally oriented. And one example in which you can see this is TikTok. So the US government was actually really concerned that many of its young people were using this Chinese app. So the app was actually split. So there is now a US-based TikTok, which is controlled by US companies. So that's just one example of how these security considerations serve to split the internet. And another example currently is the SWIFT banking system. So SWIFT is a system online through which banks can transfer funds. And it has also been used in sanctions, most notably against Iran, where Iran is not able to use the SWIFT system. And Russia has also been threatened to be cut off from the SWIFT banking system. And in response, Russia is currently investigating and developing its own alternative to SWIFT. So this is another example in which we go from one global system to multiple regional systems. And this development actually fits in very well with a broader global development in different areas, so on this side of the internet, but also in terms of production, also in terms of finance, where we see that the global world is slowly becoming more regionalized. I'm actually writing a book on this topic right now, so stay tuned for more updates on that. In the meantime, thanks for watching, stay sane, and I will see you next week.